welcome to another episode of Recently Read. This week I'm going to be reviewing Kings of Kings, The Fall of the Shah, the 1979 Iranian Revolution, and The Unmasking of the Modern Middle East by Scott Anderson. So this is sort of a continuation of my last review in which I spoke about reading Lolita in Tehran. To a certain degree, it's a continuation of that, in the sense that I'm still sort of on the same subject, which is Iran during the time of the Iranian Revolution. Now, one of the problems I think with that particular book is, well, I don't know that I would say it's a problem, but it's because it's a memoir, and so it's coming from a very sort of narrow point of view, which is the point of view of this particular individual. What you gain from that is a personal experience of someone who lived through, in the case of reading Lolita, the aftermath of the Iranian Revolution. And to a certain degree, the emotional burden that that person experienced from it, as well as some of the challenges that that person faced in her career because of it. This book is a little bit different. Kings of Kings by Scott Anderson is a history, it's sort of journalistic history. It's a very narrow focused book. It's focused very much in the period just before the fall of the Shah and the start of the Iranian Revolution, and to a certain degree, the immediate aftermath of that. Scott Anderson, in some ways, was uniquely placed to witness it. For one thing, he was at the location where he believes the Iranian Revolution began, which is the United States. In 1977, the Shah, the king of Iran, a man named Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, and his wife, Farah Pahlavi, visited the United States soon after Jimmy Carter's election to become the president of that country. And during his visit, there were large demonstrations that took place in Washington, mostly driven by, well, actually, I say mostly, primarily driven by students, Iranian students, who were in the United States at the time, studying at universities, at American universities. Now, as a side note, I this is something that also kind of came up in reading Lolita, and I was sort of curious. Why were there so many Iranian students? Not only were there many Iranian students in the United States, but it seems that the international student body was primarily Iranian students. There were a huge number of them. Now, some people may correct me on this and say, well, these are the actual numbers. But there were a massive number of students, and they were in the United States, in universities like at the University of Oklahoma, for instance, which had programs, engineering programs for petrol, for oil. And so this is one of the things that they were studying. I mean, it's not the only thing, but it seems like there were a lot of students here, a lot of middle class, upper middle class Iranians, actually, and this happens still today, were sending their children to study at universities in the United States. And so there are a lot of Iranians here. And they came out in droves to protest for and against the Shah, yelling things like, "Death to the Shah, death to the king." At this point, the Shah had been king for quite a while. In fact, the Pahlavi dynasty had been in place for not a huge amount of time, but for some time. In fact, they were put in place through the assistance of the U.S. In the 1950s. There had been a democratically elected government in Iran that were left-leaning, and the U.S. didn't like that. This is during the Cold War, and so they had a hand in the overthrow of the elected government and in helping to put the Pahlavi dynasty in place. So fast forward some decades, not too many, but a couple of decades, and now you have Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, who is now the king of Iran, and he's visiting the United States, and you have all of these students there, and there's tear gas thrown, and fights break out. And Scott Anderson was actually very young, and he was there when this was happening, and was sort of caught in the middle of all of this. He was there as a sort of gopher position in government, which he talks about in the book. So I'm not going to really detail it too much because you can read it in his own words. But at any rate, this is, in his opinion, the beginning of the Iranian Revolution, which ran essentially from the mid-1970s, I guess 77 you could say, until very, very early 80s, 80, 81, depending on your viewpoint. And again, I'm sure some people will say, well, it's very specifically this date, or it's very specifically that day. As a historian, I tend to be a little bit not dogmatic about when things begin and end, because actually I don't generally believe, historically speaking, that there's hard beginnings and hard ends to anything. I think this is a device that maybe some historians use, certainly journalists use and writers use, to sort of hook you in. But the fact of the matter is that these things never really start that definitively. There's never this sort of like solid beginning and solid ending. Although Scott Anderson places the beginning very much in this visit that the Shah, this visit the Shah had with Jimmy Carter in the United States. The story runs from about the 60s and into the 70s, and then is really, really focused. The book is really focused in this sort of very narrow period of time that is from about the late 70s, mid-late 70s, around the time of Jimmy Carter's election, into the late 70s and very early 80s, which is the major events in Iran at that time is the Shah leaving Iran, essentially abdicating, although he never officially abdicated. And that's something to think about. He left still as the king. And in fact, his son, Reza Pahlavi, is never actually said that he's not the crown prince. And so there's never really an abdication of the kingship of the royal house. So that's the main part of the story. It ends around the time of the Shah leaving Iran for an extended vacation, and also the Iran hostage crisis, which doomed Jimmy Carter's presidential run. He was running against Reagan, and in public opinion, completely mishandled that entire situation with Iran, and especially with in regards to the hostage crisis. In the middle of all this, essentially, you have a breakdown of political authority in Iran. The U.S. had been involved in Iran for a while, and I think the reason should be quite obvious. We all know that. Well, I'd say quite obvious, but maybe not so obvious, or there are a couple of different things. And again, there are a lot of people who are going to say, well, this is what the Iran Revolution and the U.S. involvement was really about. This is really why they're doing this, why the U.S. was doing this. And that's all very complicated. But essentially you have the Shah is the king, and Iran is sort of a progressive Middle Eastern country. There's references to Tehran as being the Paris of Western Asia. You have incredible education programs where people are going to universities. There's a high level of students, of young people attending university, and especially women. You have, if you see images of Iran in the 1970s and Tehran specifically in the 1970s, what you're going to see is something that's in many ways, based from when you consider our perception of Iran today, incredibly modern. Women look like they're Parisian women. The men are sort of dressed in very modern clothes, jeans and that's sort of hats that young men were wearing in the 1970s. Some of them look like hippies, or kind of what you might think of as for hippies. So you have this very modern society, but at the very edges of this, you have this incredible conservative religious movement that is kind of happening in the fringes. You have you have Ruhollah Khomeini, the Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, who is in exile. He had been exiled many years before, making these very incendiary sermons, attacking the Shah and attacking this sort of modern way of life, and saying things like, and essentially saying that death to America, America is the great Satan. And so these are very incendiary things that are happening, and the Shah is not really paying attention to this very much. He's just kind of in his country. He's sort of has a bunch of kind of yes men around him, with some exceptions, and seems to have been a very, very brilliant person. And in fact, Scott Anderson refers to that, and many people who knew him refer to him as being this incredibly brilliant person, but also just utterly frozen by inaction. And while also quite vain in many ways, he kept himself fit. He was very concerned about the way he looked. He was very concerned about the way that people interacted with him, as many royals are. At the same time, and it seems that he was a very insecure person, and didn't really like dissension around him, as many autocrats today don't like any dissension around him. And there was a tendency to sort of give him positive news even when things were not going well. So you have this, you have the Shah, you have this sort of very modern, liberal way of life that is mostly occurring in Tehran. And then in the fringes, in the countryside, what you have is the opposite of that. You have incredible religious conservatism. You have these mullahs and these ayatollahs condemning this way of life, criticizing the Shah, criticizing this westernized way of living, and also criticizing this perception, whether true or not, that's debatable. I think a lot of it is true, in that essentially the US are pulling the strings, and that the Shah is really sort of an American puppet, and forwarding American interests in Iran. And so this is what's going on. And you're seeing a lot of this even today. You have this rise of essentially poor, rural people, a lot of them men, mostly men, young, idle, who are just really itching to overthrow the Shah. So they're they're listening to these sermons on tape by Ruhollah Khomeini, who is calling for the death of the Shah and calling for the death of America. And so these people are really agitating for change. And in the middle of all this, the U.S., who has embassies of course, in Tehran and in other cities in Iran, they're just totally clueless, and they don't speak Farsi. They're just sort of, they don't really understand what's going on. They underplay a lot of the things that are happening, and meanwhile all this is happening around them. In the middle of all this, I should mention something that I learned in this book that I thought was really, really fascinating. Is there are many major figures. So there's the Pahlavi, the Shah. You have his wife, Farah Pahlavi. You have Jimmy Carter. And by the way, Jimmy Carter really does not come out well in this. Now, I've grown up sort of seeing Jimmy Carter as this sort of very sort of almost like a saintly figure, this person who's very focused on peace, and especially in the Middle East, and maybe was given a raw deal during his time as president. He was an outsider when he ran for president and became the president. He was very much an outsider. which may sound familiar to many of us today who are paying attention to American politics. But he really doesn't come off well in this. He sort of drags his feet, makes non-decisions. He wasn't trusted by the Shah and his wife. Just seems to not really be paying attention. And when he should be paying attention, other sort of crises distracted him from what was going on in Iran. Now, the thing with Iran is huge because the U.S. really had a strong sort of foothold in that region. Obviously, we know what's going on with Israel today and all the complications with that. Some of us may remember, I certainly do, the U.S. invasion of, or the U.S. intervention in the early 90s when Iraq invaded Kuwait. So the U.S. has had famously a huge impact on what happens in the Middle East. Obviously, we know what happened in the wake of 9/11. But if you go back and sort of step out of the Israel realm for a second and look at what's going on in Iran, this was a huge thing, and the U.S. had a lot to do with what was going on there. But part of the U.S.'s short-sightedness, and this is clear in Scott Anderson's book, is that they were looking at what was happening in Iran, not so much regarding the rise of this theocratic political system that was being extolled by Khomeini. That seemed to be very much not really in their area of interest. They were far more focused on, and they were looking at this more from a Cold War framework, and that is that communism must be stopped at any cost. And so the U.S.'s policy really for the last, for 40, 50 years, really from the 60s on into the 90s, and perhaps even beyond, even today, actually, if you look at what's going on today, was really about stopping the Red Scare, stopping the spread of communism. And communism, in many ways, is very much, it was and still is the sort of opposite of U.S. ideals, American ideals, free capital market ideals that America sort of believed in. Now, again, this gets to be really complicated. What does this exactly mean? Well, what it means is that in many cases, the U.S. didn't care what kind of government was taking over, whether it was theocratic, whether it was completely a dictatorship. It didn't really seem to matter. What mattered is the prevention of communism. And Iran, which shares a border with the Soviet Union, this was a concern. Of course, we know that the Soviet Union was involved in the wars in Afghanistan, so the Soviet Union has had a very heavy hand in what happens in the Middle East as well. And so that's all the U.S. seemed to care about. And so about how this sort of theocratic, arch-conservative, highly Islamist government taking over, they weren't really as concerned about that. It was a concern, but they were thinking about other things. Now, there are two really interesting figures in all of this. So obviously there's the Shah. There's Jimmy Carter, which we've already spoken about. There's Ruhollah Khomeini. But there are two sort of more peripheral figures. I say peripheral because people don't really know who they are. And I certainly didn't know who they were before I read this book. But there's two really key players in all of this that sort of can help us understand what was going on during this time. One of whom is a man named Ibrahim Yazdi. So Ibrahim Yazdi was born in Iran, educated mostly in Iran, but came to the U.S. As a student and did his graduate student studies in the U.S. and was working and living in the U.S. as a researcher, as a professor, and his family was here, his wife, his children. He becomes a really key figure on the Khomeini side. He becomes, because he's very sort of westernized, Americanized in many ways, lives in the U.S., he becomes the person who is almost like the mouthpiece for Khomeini during interviews. And this is a person who is a much more moderate person, but who seems to align himself with Khomeini no matter what Khomeini's plans are. And this is a very complicated thing. I certainly am not going to claim to fully understand it. And I'm not even sure that Scott Anderson fully understands it either because, well, I say that and he may disagree, but essentially he is a person who seems to, even as Khomeini's rhetoric is quite incendiary, remains by Khomeini and becomes involved in the new government and sort of almost is a link between the U.S. and Iran in an odd kind of way. But he's also someone who is deeply religious, and despite living in the United States, he still sort of aligns himself with a far more conservative religious movement, and is involved even towards the end of his time. Well, even at the beginning of the revolution, is even involved in some of the uglier aspects, and there are many ugly aspects, but uglier aspects of the rise of the Ayatollah and the supreme leader, and the transition from the government that was under the Shah to a new government that is now led by the Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, the supreme leader. And another interesting person in this is a person named Michael Matrenko. Now, his direct involvement is much more peripheral in the sense that he wasn't involved with indirect events per se, political events, but he was an American. He was working for the embassy, and sort of a more junior level, if I understand that correctly. And he was sort of the thorn on the sides of the Americans and the embassy, the sort of like, I don't know, older, more senior members of the embassy, who all wanted to pretend that everything was going really well. And Michael Matrenko, who happened to be the only person, or seems to be one of the only people who could speak Farsi, had a real strong connection with people on the street, seems to have been the kind of person who went out and talked to people and made friends. He was saying, hey, there's bad stuff going on, and we really need to be paying attention to this. And the officials, Michael Sullivan being one of the main ones, were just like, this guy, he's an alarmist. They would sort of give him a dress down for being too alarmist, and they would send his reports back to Washington in snail mail, the slowest possible way that you can send them over to Washington, in such a way that Scott Anderson says, they're the kind of reports that would not be read. And he's a very interesting figure, this Michael Matrenko, because he also was there and became one of the victims or the hostages during the Iran hostage crisis. And at one point even had a noose put around his neck because they were going to hang him. And he had to be careful because even though he knew Farsi, a very rare thing for Americans, even Americans who had been working and living in Iran for a long time, knowing Farsi would be a sort of, would code him to the Iranians as being the CIA, or in the CIA. And so he really, really was a key figure in sort of seeing what was happening on the ground, but also became someone whose life became very much in danger during the revolution and the hostage crisis. So very fascinating. This is a book, I think, that is really important today because guess what's happening in Iran right now? You have mass protests over runaway inflation, which is not that dissimilar to what was going on in the 1970s, actually. Other things that are not quite mentioned in the news, but surely are part of what's going on, is widespread corruption, which is surely going on. It was going on in the 1970s under the Shah, and it's probably going on today. You have, you have these protests where now actually it's turning out that hundreds of people are being killed by the military under the direction of the current government. which is under the direction of the supreme leader. So these things are happening in real time today. You have women protesting today. Just recently, there was a marathon in which thousands of women showed up, not wearing a chador, not wearing a veil, and so the veil is and the chador is mandated in Iran now. You can say it's become a soft mandate today, probably not what it was like in the early 80s, which was a far more hard mandate, it would appear. But these things are happening today. And so right now, Iran is suddenly in a position where something might happen there, not dissimilar to what happened in the late 70s. And one of the interesting things is, and I already mentioned this person, is that the Shah never abdicated. He died soon after leaving Iran because he had cancer. He was very sick. But his son is still alive, and the son, the crown prince, Reza Pahlavi, he's still around. He splits his time between the U.S. and Europe and Egypt, and now he's in the news, and he's sort of agitating for maybe President Trump making an intervention in Iran. So these things are very relevant today. We're coming in many ways full circle in Iran and much of the Middle East, but Iran very specifically. And so in many ways, this book is very timely because of what's going on today. So I recommend this book. I would put it as required reading. If you want a good book that covers the history, the very specific history of the end of the Shah and the rise of Khomeini and the Iranian Revolution, I really don't know of a better book to read than this book right now, especially because of the events that are going on today. So this is incredibly timely because of that. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed this episode. Join us again next week for another episode of Recently Read, and thanks for watching.